Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Totalbiscuit. We're going to take a little tour here of Planetside 2. Before you scream about the NDA, you don't need to worry, this was taken from the press build, from the press day, some time ago. I kept it in reserve because I thought you guys might be chomping at the bit just a little bit with a lack of video content about Planetside 2. So at the moment we're fighting in the evening over this particular facility. As you can see, the tech plant has been taken by the new conglomerate, and we're rolling in a couple of tanks and infantry here or there to try and deal with it. I'm currently in a Lightning, which is paper tank, quite frankly. That's what it was referred to back in Planetside 1 for a very good reason, because this bloody thing dies very, very easily and has problems getting over very basic obstacles. I'm going to bail on it now. It's very effective at bringing down infantry, but it's also very effective at dying horribly. So I'm going to bail on that. But as you can see here, I'm actually using one of the night vision scopes, which can be fairly useful. I think one of the problems that Planetside 2 has at the moment is clear target recognition, and that can be made even more difficult in a night environment, as you might imagine. Unfortunately, this scope is flat out useless during the day, so might be something you want to keep for a specialized loadout. Alright, well, that's a drop pod eventually landing on the ground there. Some of the drop pods have a tendency to bug out, as you might imagine. The purpose of this video really is to show you a variety of different facilities within the game, the kind of things that you're going to be fighting over, because there is more to that than meets the eye. And while there's been a lot of focus on bases, because of course the E3 stream was all surrounding one base, what there hasn't been a big focus on are things like towers, the way that bases are laid out, the capture points and their locations, as well as the idea of smaller facilities. As you can see, this version of the build also had some problems, including non-animated max units, which, quite frankly, were extremely intimidating, regardless of the fact that they didn't actually move properly, but hey, never mind. Now I want to show you some base interiors, because you've seen quite a lot of the tech plant, you've seen quite a lot of the amp station, although I will show you the tech plant in greater detail after this. What I haven't shown you is the Biolab. Now, those of you wondering about indoor combat, the Biolab seems to be the facility that's going to have the most of it. Now, these facilities are not identical. In fact, they're claiming that each facility has been customized to some degree, but the Biolab seems to have a lot of indoor points and a lot of indoor warfare. So with that in mind, folks, let's actually take a look. I'm going to drop pod down onto a Biolab, or at least close by, because that's where my squad happens to be. That's the region that you can see in the bottom left corner, and there is the Biolab now that we've come into the range of control. Now, this facility has 6 capture points that you will be required to grab in order to actually attempt to capture the base. You don't need all of them, but the more that you have, the faster your little bar builds up there, and that will initiate a cooldown on the base so that it cannot be recaptured for a certain amount of time. Now, the Biolab, as I mentioned, does have a lot of indoor combat, but it's not all about that. There are facilities outside, and this is very, very common within Planetside 2. What they decided to do was make facilities a little bit more varied in terms of where the capture points actually were. In facilities in Planetside 1, the hack point was actually a single terminal, which was always inside the base, which resulted in some fairly lengthy and protracted sieges and an awful lot of sitting around getting hit by AoE, which quite frankly is not all that enjoyable. The combat was not particularly dynamic. You'll notice that this Biolab has point B inside a facility quite a way away from the actual building itself. You can see that just in the distance there. We're going to get close to it fairly soon. Do not worry your pretty little heads. But the Biolab has most of its points indoors, and control of the interior is perhaps the most important. The nice thing is that you do get a varied selection of combat environments when you happen to fight over any of these bases. So if you're into vehicle warfare, you can be useful. If you're into interior warfare, you can be useful. In Planetside 1, it was more of a case of use the vehicles to get to the base, then get them out of the courtyard, and then just keep rushing the base over and over again until you eventually ended up capturing it. Occasionally, of course, you would be able to galaxy drop onto the top, depending on the layout of the base. Notice there another area, that being point A, which is an outdoor facility once again. Once I grab that, I'm going to head indoors and see what is available inside the Biolab. You're not going to be seeing a huge amount of combat in this video because it was a press test. There weren't a huge amount of players available. There's about 20 or so press on at the time, as well as a few play testers here and there. It was very easy to actually completely avoid the combat and make your way in to have a look at pretty much anything you wanted to look at, as long as there weren't any enemies around. Alright, let's head on over to the Biolab, shall we? The Biolab can be accessed, of course, from the air or via the use of teleporters on the ground. Keeping control of this area, which is also a heavy vehicle spawn point, is fairly vital, because this is the area where you will find the easiest access into the Biolab itself. We're going to just have a look around here, make sure there are no enemies, and also get a pretty nice look at the facility. Quite frankly, it's beautiful, and when it comes to scale, well, Planetside 2 does have a tendency of delivering in that regard. It's big, and the facilities are big, as you would expect. It'd be very disappointing if that were not the case. Alright, enough of that nonsense, let's get inside. So the teleporters on the ground will allow you to immediately make your way into the Biolab. I'd like to point out that some of the interior of this Biolab at the time of this recording is untextured, so you might see some stuff that looks pretty damn ugly. There is a reason for that. They haven't finished the art assets on it. Beta is, of course, beta, or in this case, I believe it was actually the alpha version when this recording was done. So the Biolab, as you might imagine, is this big giant biodome where biological research goes on. Lord knows for why. I assume they're just not growing crops to feed the soldiers, considering the soldiers die every 25 seconds or so. There are air vehicle pads, significant ones in fact. This is also an area that would allow you to very easily assault it with a galaxy. You could land a galaxy right here, and as long as you could protect it, you would actually have a spawn point on top of the building, which would allow you to rush the interior of the Biolab, where several capture points are. A lot of the warfare inside of here, I would imagine, is going to be building-to-building fighting, room clearing, and some pretty cool urban combat. It is possible to actually fight within the jungle, as it were. I've been in a couple of biolabs. Some of them seem to have more of this interior jungle than others, so I would imagine that there is a little bit of variation there, although the layouts will remain fairly similar so that you don't get too lost within them. Regardless, I think the Biolab is one of the cooler facilities if you are really into interior combat, urban warfare, and that kind of stuff, which is what you're going to find in abundance, quite frankly, if you happen to be fighting over a Biolab. The number of facilities this time around has been limited to 3 rather than the 5 that were in the original Planetside. The facilities that are missing from Planetside 2, at least at the moment, bearing in mind this is a free-to-play game and it's most likely going to get some fairly severe updating over the course of the years that it's available, are the Dropship Center and the Interlink Facility. The Interlink Facility, if I recall correctly, gave you radar benefits, and the Dropship Center was for spawning dropships. That role is now a feature of the tech plants. Aside from that, though, the effect of facilities in Planetside 2 does seem to be significantly reduced in comparison to the original game. Tech plants in Planetside 1 allowed you to spawn advanced assault vehicles. That included stuff like the Reaver, which at the time, of course, if you don't recall, or you've never actually played Planetside 1, the Reaver was a cross-faction vehicle. It was a common pool vehicle. Anyone could have it. The Reaver is now new conglomerate only. There were actually a lot of vehicles, like faction main battle tank, things like that. You couldn't build it. So that was, quite frankly, a pretty big deal. Biolabs back in Planetside 1 actually lowered your spawn time if you happen to have a facility on the map, because everything was linked together with this so-called lattice system. That is not in Planetside 2, because they've got this hex-based territory map. And amp stations, if I recall correctly, did give you a shield benefit, but Planetside 2 only seems to have a specific benefit from owning the tech lab. You can't get galaxies unless you happen to have a tech lab, although I believe you can spawn them at the warp gate regardless, so perhaps not a big deal. I think the tech lab is the only facility outside of the warp gate that actually has a galaxy spawn terminal, which is a separate terminal entirely from your normal air terminal. Simply because of the size of the bloody things. You can't spawn it on a tiny little air pad. That would be quite comical. Whatever the case, we don't know if there are any other benefits from owning an amp station or a biolab in the same way that there were in Planetside 1, but you want to grab them regardless, because of course you get the ability to spawn there, and you earn a ton of resources for your faction and for yourself by owning these various facilities. Now, you've seen the tech lab and the amp station many times in the footage that I've provided, but what you haven't really seen are these smaller outposts, and you also haven't seen how towers come into play. In Planetside 1, towers were fairly damn important. They provided a holdfast and staging area for assaults on bases. Here, things are a little bit different. Welcome to what could be considered an outpost. This is a smaller area. It's not a tower. It has a tower as part of it, but it's also not a base either. So one has to wonder, what exactly is the point of it? It's called the Stronghold, and there are various areas like this. It's essentially a fire base set in the middle of the map. Very, very useful because, of course, it has vehicle spawning facilities, but it's not a full-sized base. Combat over this base is probably going to take less time, although you never know. The tower over there could be difficult to take, and there is, of course, a walled-off area that evokes very much a memory of Starship Troopers. You're going to have troops on the walls firing down, max units and things like that, and you can see that it is part of our territory, and it is actually fairly vital in terms of logistics. This is probably going to be one of those facilities that is highly contested, simply because if we have a little bit of a flight over here, you will notice that it is very close to this tech plant. This is quite similar to the way towers actually operated within Planetside 1. You'd often find a tower, in fact you would always find at least one tower close by to a facility, and this would allow you to attack on foot. In this case though, they've upped the ante just a little bit. Running on foot over from the stronghold could be risky, but not unviable. However, since you can actually spawn vehicles at that facility, holding it seems like it would be absolutely vital. You don't have to roll from a facility, you can roll instead from the stronghold or one of these smaller outposts around the area. Towers are also included as capture points sometimes in larger facilities, depending on how they decide to actually organize everything. Once again, each of these bases is slightly different, although themed in a very specific fashion, as you might imagine. So the thing you've got to understand about Planetside is that it's all about logistics. If you hold nearby facilities, and if you have a lot of active transport vehicles and galaxy spawn points, your faction is going to be significantly more successful. If you don't hold spawn points or the ability to transport large number of troops, then you're going to run into problems. Why? Well, it should be fairly obvious, I would think. You can't get to the fight. It's difficult to do so. Now, they are putting in an instant action system, which will allow you to actually drop pod into a fight, but you're going to drop pod in without a vehicle, you're going to drop pod in without your squad, and let's be honest, one soldier in Planetside doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. Now, I will admit it, I was flying over here really for my own personal whimsy, because these more verdant areas are some of the best-looking areas on this particular continent of Indar, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they come up with when they finally release Amaresh, which is known as the greenest of the continents. It was a really, really good looker, but that's quite frankly gorgeous. I mean, there are some texture problems here and there, I'll certainly say, and some of that's most likely due to the fact that this was alpha footage, and some of it's probably due to the fact they're going to have to limit some of the texture work because of just how large this game's going to end up being. Now, we are flying rather awkwardly straight into the communications tower, because why not, over another even smaller outpost area. This has only got a single capture point, and it can often take quite some time to grab it. If it's way behind enemy lines, unless you have a large number of people there to capture it, you're going to have problems. But that is almost the equivalent of a tower in Planetside 1, because it doesn't really have any useful consoles there. It doesn't have a vehicle spawning area, but it does have the ability to respawn, and it does, of course, have loadouts that you can use, so you can switch around your role if need be. I'll just park it ever so slightly over there and actually go and take a look at it. You're still going to be fighting over this kind of thing. In Planetside 1, you'd have just been fighting over a tower, and there were like 3 designs of it. Here, you're fighting over just this little prefab facility. It's a smaller map. It's got 1 point involved in it, but it's still very, very useful. You've got a variety of buildings around here. That is the point in the center here, so it's just like King of the Hill, essentially, when you're trying to grab one of these really small outposts. But it's a spawn point, and it happens to be in the middle of enemy territory. We'd like to take that territory away from the new conglomerate, give it to the Terran Republic, and it gives us the ability to have just yet another spawn point that is nearby our objectives. Now, there's one last area that I'd like to show you, which once again is a different example of how things are laid out in the kind of scale. I've shown you a full-sized base, I've shown you 2 capture point outposts, I've shown you this tiny little outpost that has 1, but what I also have is the Crossroads Watchtower, which is a tower and outpost combined into 3 capture points. It should be fairly obvious where I am. As you can see, you've got the Biolab in the distance right there. This is a tower. I believe this is an air tower. It has multiple layers of defenses. I believe there are supposed to be turrets around here somewhere. You can also spawn aircraft from it. So it's a good thing to have, honestly. It will give you a lot of mobility, but in order to hold this area, you don't just have to hold the tower. No, indeed you do not. There is a capture point in a facility over to the other side of that area. You can see point C over there, and we'll have a quick little run in that direction to show you what it involves. Holding an area like this is a little bit trickier, but it can be more rewarding. It's got a lot of useful panels, it's got spawning facilities that you might want to get a hold of, and it seems to be in a really good spot in order to engage that biolab over in the distance. These are the kind of areas you're also going to want to hold, because the larger it is, the chances are the more resources you will gain from actually grabbing it in the first place, so it is highly recommended that you deal with that. Going to try and scare that Reaver off. I don't want him anywhere near this facility. I would dearly like to grab it. It's going to be a little bit difficult to do on my own, needless to say. In the full game, you can expect to be doing this with squads or indeed entire platoons, and it's entirely feasible for outfits to choose to hold areas like this that they deem to be strategically important, and you get some pretty cool siege warfare. I think I'm very much looking forward to fighting over the stronghold, for instance, because of the way that it's set up. That whole Alamo last stand kind of feel that it's got could really lead to some pretty epic stuff. Indeed, there is a lot of variety over where you're going to fight in Planetside 2, whereas Planetside 1, it kind of lacked. The problem with Planetside 1 is that since everything was based around indoor facilities, being outside really was just a case of the journey from A to B. Occasionally, there would be a big tank fight over a bridge or something like that, because you couldn't logistically make your way over to where you needed to go. But most of the time, a lot of the fighting was indoors, and it wasn't all that interesting. Here, there's just much more variety. There's indoor fighting, outdoor fighting, urban warfare. Each of the bases look different, and there are these huge areas which allow for combined arms much more effectively. It helps that there's more cover as well. Being outdoors as a foot soldier could really spell death for you in Planetside 1. There were very few areas to take cover from vehicles, and quite frankly, tanks and aircraft reigned supreme out there. Here, because you've got a lot more doodads on the ground, a lot more facilities and places to take cover, then you have a lot more luck if you happen to be on foot. That also helps max units outside as well, which didn't used to be something that was particularly advisable as far as I'm concerned. Now, before we conclude, this is something for the Planetside 1 veterans. Yes, it is a rather large bridge. Bridges were one of the only places in Planetside 1 where you'd really get this outdoor combat feel without someone having to essentially organize a tank battle. These bridges are vitally important for transport, and you tend to get some pretty cool tank battles and long-range combat. Snipers are quite effective here as well, because, of course, infantry would try to get onto the ground nearby. As you can see, there's actually a tower facility very close, so you can expect some pretty classic bridge battles over areas like this. Okay, folks, hopefully that gives you an idea of how base capturing and how grabbing smaller facilities is vitally important within Planetside 2. A little bit more variety than the original there. My name's been Totalbiscuit, and I shall see you next time.